Hi Algebra students, this is video 8. In this video we're learning how to solve quadratic equations using square roots. So when we want to solve using square roots, the type of equations that we're allowed to solve using square roots look like this: ax squared plus c equals 0. So notice how standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. There's no bx term. So when there's no bx term, we are allowed to solve using square roots. So there's only two steps we need to do to solve these equations. First, we need to get x squared by itself. That's what isolate means, get x squared by itself on one side of the equation. So here we have x squared minus 49. It is not by itself, so the way we can get it by itself is add 49 to both sides. So now we have x squared equals 49. Okay, now x squared is isolated. We can take the square root of both sides. So the reason we do that is the opposite of squaring a number is the square root. They undo each other. So if we want to get x by itself, we need to undo that squared, and whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other. So now we have x equals, and you probably want to say 7, because the square root of 49 is 7. But there's one thing you need to be careful of. This original equation said that something squared gave us 49. And it's absolutely right that 7 squared is 49, but the other thing that gets squared to get 49 is -7. So when you're solving these, you actually need to put a plus or minus symbol in front of that 7 because we need the positive and we need the -7. So that's our two answers. And if you were writing it on your online homework, it would be -7 and +7. So remember that a positive number always has two square roots. Okay, we're going to jump down here to number 4. We need to get the x squared all by itself. In order to do that, we need to subtract 7 from both sides. So we get x squared equals 81. Now that x squared is by itself, we can take the square root of both sides. And the square root of 81 is 9. But remember, x is the number that got squared to get 81. So it could have been the positive 9, but it also could have been -9. So our two solutions are -9 and +9. Okay? We're going to jump down here to number 9. To get the x squared by itself, we now have a couple of steps. The first thing we have to do is we need to add the 108 to both sides. So then we get 3x squared equals 108. Now that we've done that, we can divide both sides by 3, and we have x squared equals 108 divided by 3 is 36. And now that x squared is by itself, we're ready to take the square root of both sides. And remember, we need the positive and the negative square root, and the square root of 36 is 6. So the answers are positive and -6. Okay. Not every answer that you'll get in today's homework will be this nice, just a nice clean whole number. I'm going to do a couple examples where they're not as nice. So sometimes we will get irrational solutions, which just means sometimes you won't be able to simplify that square root very nicely at all. So we're going to do number 17 here. Looks pretty straightforward. We need to get the x squared by itself, so we need to add 3 to both sides. X squared equals 3. Then we need to take the square root of both sides, and when we take the square root, we need the positive and negative version of our answer, but we don't know what the square root of 3 is, and we can't simplify that, so we just leave it as the square root of 3. So our two solutions are the negative square root of 3 and the positive square root of 3. And it looks kind of scary, but they're numbers, they're valid solutions. Just be careful when you're typing in your online homework. In the typing box, a little like math icon box should come up, and it should have square root symbols in there. So that's how you can type that in online. All right, and we'll do one more here. Number 22. What we would need to do first is subtract 8 from both sides. So we get negative 3x squared equals negative 30. And x squared still isn't by itself, so we need to divide by negative 3 to make it be by itself. So we get x squared equals 10. When you take the square root of both sides, you get x equals positive or negative, and we can't simplify the square root of 10. We don't know what it is, so we just leave it. So we get the negative square root of 10 and the positive square root of 10. You actually don't need to put the plus sign there. Okay, those are our two solutions. All right, there's one more type of problem that you're going to see on your homework, and those look like this. So these look way different, or they look kind of scary compared to what we just did, but really the process is almost the same. So before we were trying to get the x squared by itself. Now what we need to do is we need to just get whatever is in the parentheses here that's being squared, we need to get that by itself. So we need to get the x minus 10 squared by itself. So the first thing we're going to do is add 36 to both sides. So we get 2 x minus 10 squared equals 2. Okay. Then this parentheses squared still isn't by itself, so to make it be by itself we have to get rid of that 2, and the way to do that is to divide by 2. So then we have x minus 10 squared equals 1. Now that the parentheses squared is by itself, we're ready to take the square root. So remember, the way to get rid of something being squared is to do the opposite, and the opposite of squaring something is taking the square root. So if we take the square root of both sides, what happens here is the square root and the squared cancel, and all we're left with is x minus 10. And the square root of 1 is 1, but we still need the positive or negative version of that. So from here, it's easiest if you rewrite this as two equations, because this really is two numbers. So what I mean is one equation equals negative 1, and one equation equals positive 1. And now we can solve each of those equations for x by adding 10 to both sides. And what we get on this first equation is 9, and what we could get on the second equation is 11. So our two solutions are 9 and 11. So again, what we did, instead of isolating, the x squared, we isolated the parentheses squared. And then once we did that, we could take the square root. We got the positive and negative version of the square root, split it into two equations, and solve for x. So we'll do it one more time for one last example. Okay, so this next problem here, we need to get the parentheses squared by itself. So first, you need to add 29 to both sides. And we have 3 times x minus 3 squared equals, let's see, what is that? 9 plus 4 is 13, that's 63. Then we need to divide both sides by 3, and you get x minus 3 squared equals 21. And now we reached our first goal of getting the parentheses squared by itself. Now, in order to get rid of that squared, we have to take the square root of both sides. So the square rooting something squared just undoes the squared, and we're left with x minus 3 equals the positive or negative, and then what is the square root of 21? If you're not sure if you can simplify the square root of 21, remember back in our square root unit, we made factor trees and looked for factor pairs. 7 and 3 are the only factors of 21, other than 1 and 21, and each of those are prime. There's no pairs. We can't simplify it, so we do just need to leave it as the square root of 21. Okay, so now we need to solve for x, but this is really two different numbers, so we're going to write our equation with one of them equaling negative square root of 21 and one of them equaling the positive square root of 21. Then you need to get x by itself, so you would need to add 3 to both sides of each equation. And on this one you get x equals 3 and the square root of 21 are not like terms, so you don't get to combine them. There's nothing you get to do other than just write 3 minus the square root of 21. And for this one, it's just x equals 3 plus the square root of 21. There's no extra combining that you get to do. So then our two solutions here are 3 minus the square root of 21 and 3 plus the square root of 21. So these problems are certainly a little bit more lengthy, a little more involved, but just be careful. Make sure you always do the positive and negative when you're taking your square roots, because we know that if you graph a parabola, it often has two x-intercepts, and just as a reminder, that's what we're finding. We're finding the x-intercepts. Our solutions are x-intercepts. So make sure you use your positive or negative. Make sure you isolate the x squared or the parentheses squared. And now you're ready to go do homework 8 on Delta Math. Let me know if you have questions, and good luck.